Hi, welcome to Walking in the Word. Today we are going to be taking a look at a short passage in a book called Ecclesiastes. It's in the Old Testament and it talks a little bit about the meaning of life. So, join me as we take a look at what the author has to say. Welcome to Walking in the Word, weekly devotional from Beacon Church. My name is Pastor Josh, and today we are going to be taking a look at a couple of verses in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, Ecclesiastes is a book in the Old Testament. It's one that we don't talk about all that much, but it comes up fairly frequently in the context of funerals. So last week we talked about love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and part of that was I had just officiated a wedding for a couple of friends of ours, and that was on my mind. This upcoming weekend, I'm officiating a funeral. So that's kind of been on my mind. And Ecclesiastes is a book that often comes up when we're thinking about the end of life. And a part of that is because Ecclesiastes deals with the purpose of life in a way, the context of life, the nature of life. So it's a book of wisdom literature from the Old Testament. And within it, there are two different people who are talking. The first is the author of the book. Okay, we don't know who the author was. Tradition tells us that it's Solomon, but we don't know that for sure. He doesn't identify himself anywhere in the book. But there's the author, and then the second person who's talking is the teacher. And that's this character that's in the book who is teaching the wisdom that they have gained through the course of their life. And if you've ever read Ecclesiastes or ever heard anybody talk about it, the book can sometimes feel like kind of a downer. And the reason being, the author introduces the book, or not the author, the teacher introduces the book by saying that everything in life is utterly meaningless. And the sense of the word that they're using there is really more like this idea that life is a vapor. It's sort of like smoke, where it looks pretty, it can look pretty, it can seem as though it's a solid substance, but when you go to reach for it, you can't latch onto it and it dissipates quickly. And life is this sort of fleeting, smoky, murky thing that we all are experiencing. So it's not meaningless in the sense that we would think of it in our culture necessarily, but sort of more this idea that it's this fleeting vapor. So the book kind of goes through this idea of life being like this vapor, and it looks at it in three ways. It looks at the inevitable passage of time, the reality that we are all going to die, and then at the end, this idea that no matter how we do choose to live our lives, there's this sort of unpredictability to it. Right? So at the very beginning, in chapter 3, there's this little section that you will often hear read in the context of funerals, and it says this: "There's a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And in this section of the book, the teacher is going through this idea that time is this inevitably marching thing. None of us can stop it. Our lives will continue inevitably forward until they eventually end. And that's sort of the next thing he hits on, is that death is coming for everybody. And in this section, he's really sort of highlighting that, right? That as time marches on, there is a time for everything, right? There's a time when we were born. There's a time when we will ultimately die. There's a time for each of the tasks that comes in our day and in our life. And he's trying to highlight that reality that as we march through our lives, this is this inevitable thing that leads to our death. And again, that can be kind of a downer, right? It's just like, ugh, kind of idea, like, oh my gosh, like, We're just talking about this. We're doing this because eventually we're just going to die. So what's the point? And something that I find refreshing in the book of Ecclesiastes is that as much as time is this inevitably marching forward thing, and as much as death is a reality that will come true for all of us in our lives, and as much as later in the book he talks about this idea of fearing the Lord and doing what he says and living by wisdom, but in that chance area of the book, he talks about how even if you do that, you're not guaranteed to have a good life. You're not guaranteed these things. But as the book closes, the teacher finishes what he's saying. And then at the very end, there's this little section where the author has a comment. And he says this: "Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." And he's wrapping, that's the last two verses of the book, and he's wrapping this book up by saying, time is this inevitably marching thing. Death is something that is true in all of our lives. Chance is something that's true in all of our lives. We're not guaranteed anything. And the reality is, 1,000 years from now, no one is likely to remember any of us. But now that we have heard all of this, the conclusion is that our duty is to fear God and keep his commands, because that is the pathway that will give us the best life, right? To appreciate the blessings that we've been given, to follow the commands that God has offered us to guide our lives into the life he wants for us, to guide us back toward what he desires for us in our lives. And later in the New Testament, Jesus echoes this by saying the two greatest commandments are this: love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And all of the other commandments hang upon these two. Right? Fear God and keep his commandments. So even though when we look around, life can often feel like this vaporous material that we can't quite grasp onto, and we look around and we see people who are perhaps not the greatest being really successful, and perhaps we see people who we perceive as being good suffering, and all of these things happen in our lives, and we can often have this sort of existential sense that things might be unfair. But what we do know is that we believe in a God who is just. We believe in a God who loves us. We believe in a God who's given us commands to follow for our benefit, to bless us, so that we will live a life in accordance with his will and his desire for us to be who we are and who he made us to be. And that's how this book closes out. So as much as the book can be something of a downer, what it's doing is highlighting this reality that for us, life can sometimes feel challenging or fleeting or difficult. And sometimes it is. But if we are fearing God and we are keeping his commandments, we are doing what we were designed to do. We're doing what God asks us to do. So as we head out to the rest of our day and as we begin to head into the weekend, I want to challenge you and challenge myself to remember that God loves us. He cares for us. He wants what's best for us. And what that means is we need to have the fear of the Lord and follow his commandments. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time.